Welcome, everyone, once again to another episode of Luke Reacts. And this week, I'm joined with Andrew Doran, and the two of us are going to react to Syria's, collapse, the fall of the Assad regime, 50 years, and everything that's happened. It's been a crazy week. But before I get there, let me remind you once again to please like and subscribe to this channel. It's very important. It's also the end of the year. So if you feel like giving, feel generous, feel free to give us a little bit of holiday cheer, Christmas cheer, Hanukkah cheer, whatever you celebrate. We'll take your generosity at any point. So, Andrew, thank you for joining me. Andrew, I asked Andrew to join me for this because not only is he a good friend and a colleague, he works with me here at the Philos Project, but he has a background of doing some journalism and some work with the State Department in basically northeast Syria, and so he's got experience from being boots on the ground. Andrew, can you tell me a little bit about your experience in northeast Syria and what brought you there, and what are you seeing on the ground right now? From your vantage point, if you will.
Thank you, Luke. Well, I haven't been on the ground myself in several years. The first time I was there, I'd been to several countries adjoining on the border with Syria. And in 2013 and 14, I went from Iraq to Turkey and with a small group from Turkey across the border into northeastern Syria into Hazaka province and met what was then a small majority Christian force, Syriac troops fighting for independence with what would become the SDF, and that unit became very significant. Several thousand fighters joined, and they were the SDF in the northeast was securing independence from both the regime and fighting Islamists, especially ISIS, and they ended up being the most reliable force. So I went back again in the summer of 2017 at the height of the Caliphate War and joined that same unit as they were fighting ISIS in Raqqa. I wrote several stories from the ground. I'd previously that summer been in Mosul in Iraq, where the Iraqi military was finishing off ISIS, driving them out of Mosul. ISIS has never been completely eradicated. And then the next year, I went to work after doing a mix of nonprofit and freelance journalism. I went back to the State Department where I'd served for 3 years. And yes, yeah, I think that the question was about background. So I hope that's
Yeah. No, that's yeah. I mean, basically now everybody knows why I asked you here, which is good. All right, so man, it took what, 10 days for Syria to collapse, which was utterly insane.
Yeah.
And you have several groups. You mentioned one, the SDF, which stands for the Syrian Defense Force, right? Syrian Defense Force. Then you have a couple other groups, and the one that's in the news the most is this group called HTS, right? Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Yeah, that's me trying to,
Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, basically an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Yeah.
I know. Well, I think perhaps some of our readers will or watchers will. I want to let everybody know it's not a Korean boy band, right? HTS is not to be confused with the BTS. All right, so it is it's a. I mean, what is their what's their vibe? What kind of rebel group are they? What's who's backing them?
Yeah.
And why? How on earth did they get so strong?
Yeah, I think if you go back about 10 years, when this issue the issues we're talking about, Christians in the Middle East, U.S. interests in the Middle East, there was a strong urge to overthrow the Assad regime, and there were many who felt if that were to happen, it would be destabilizing. The Assad regime was a secular Ba'athist regime, and much like the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, um, and pretty ruthless, pretty brutal dictatorship, but one that was a minority government, meaning that it came from the minority Alawite community. That's a Shia offshoot from the mountains near Latakia. And the Alawites, the Alawi, um, when they came to power under Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez, were pretty ruthless in putting down any sort of Islamist uprising. So um, in 2014, 2015, several rebel groups, many of them, most of them, the most effective ones being Islamist, um, began to make a lot of headway against the Syrian regime. Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia, especially Russian air power, proved to be decisive in keeping the regime in power. But what effectively happened fairly early on in the Syrian civil war is that the central governance broke apart. Americans are used to looking at a map and seeing a country and thinking that the country, the state, and the nation are all one thing. A nation's really an idea, country's the boundaries, and the state is the government. And so in the Middle East, these things are not usually, not always unified. There was a famous line from Charles Glass about the diplomat he was talking to, and he included it, and he said, the Egyptians are the only nation, Egypt is the only nation in the Middle East, the rest are tribes with flags. And it was ended up becoming at the time a somewhat famous utterance because there's a lot of validity to it. So for the last 10 years or so, Syria has already been divided into the group we back, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely Kurdish, secular, some socialist ideologue groups, the YPG, for example, affiliated with the PKK in Turkey, which is a Kurdish party that the Turks consider a terrorist organization. But we backed that group. It wasn't only YPG, but they were the most effective fighters against ISIS, and they've also protected Christians and other minorities, and they've been a very reliable partner, and they've been promoting democracy in northeastern Syria very effectively. This is an example of where, and this often happens with the Kurds, where the U.S. has done something effective, where the U.S. has had success. We're used to hearing, oh, everything is a failure, everything we've done has been miserable. Well, our ally Israel is quite reliable and has been hugely effective at advancing their interests and ours. The SDF has been very good on the ground. So the other
but you have, I mean,
groups,
so you have this group that comes, that I mean, I think a lot of people coming to this, they'll remember the Syrian civil war. They might have heard of Assad. They'll hear of the brutality, the refugees that fled into Turkey, etc.
into Europe.
And then it went quiet for years, right? And then suddenly you have this moment now, and people are like, "Oh, it's a great thing because Assad's gone," or "It's not a good thing because now the Islamists are in charge." You have this moment where it's almost like too soon to tell, but it sure seems to be, one of the things, I keep, reminding people of, or actually not reminding, just telling, because I don't think people know, is that Syria was created basically by, the French. The British and the French basically divided up the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire collapsed because they were on the wrong side of World War I. Right. So these kind of nations were created, these famous, like, we'll just, a couple of dudes in a room with maps and straight lines and going, oh, let's just cut this right. This looks like a good place to draw a line. Right. That was them. Right. And the French and the British divided up. So you had Lebanon and Syria were basically held by the French, and then Transjordan, and eventually becomes Israel. and Iraq, and we're all kind of created in a sense by the British. So Assad's grandfather, as I understand the story, basically said to the French, "Don't put us with the Sunnis," because he was Alawite, which is like a minority sect, and any kind of minority sect, particularly a minority sect in Islam, they're often seen as being, it's like the, they're the, for in a lot of ways they're like almost like Mormons or Jehovah's Witness, in which like they self-identify as Muslims, but the majority of Muslims don't identify them as Muslims, right? So it's like they have the wrong doctrine somewhere along the way. And so that's the Alawites. And so the Alawites are a minority controlling a majority. And then they had some other minorities join in them in that power structure, holding back this tide of Sunnis. And Assad's grandfather was like, "Don't put us with these people. Don't put us with the Sunnis." The French didn't listen. And so as a result, he had to, in a traditional, proper colonial sense, had to hold back through brutality this, the majority who wants to be free or at least take over or whatever, right? And so, one of the, there was, in some of the rebellions of the Sunnis of the past, even under Assad's father, where I think it was in Homs or Hama, where the Sunnis rose up and the response was kill everybody and pave it with concrete, right? Like it's, that kind of brutality.
There's a Muslim Brotherhood uprising in Hama in 1982, and Hafez al-Assad put it down ruthlessly. And when the Civil War began, or the rebellion or the protest, whatever you want to call it, in 2011, the story is that Bashar, who came to power in 2000, his mother said, "You have to do what your father did in Hama." And
right. And wasn't it, if I remember right, wasn't that the graffiti that the boy sprayed
2011
on the wall? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a brutal overreaction, and this is where it gets very hard for people who, on the one hand, you'll have those like us who are concerned about Christians and other minorities, um, but will have a tendency to say, well, look, the Saddam and the Assads, these regimes were good to Christians. That was not always the case, and a number of people a number of Christians from Lebanon, for example, disappeared in the night. Lebanon was always part of Syria, and the Assad family kind of regarded it that way. But absolutely brutal tactics used against people to maintain power, and a lot of this is coming out as the prisons are being opened there. On the other hand, at the other extreme, you have people who say, "Oh, punish the Christians and all the minorities for everything that they've done,
Right.
joining in with the oppressors." Well, the Christians.
But that's historically the way that's historically the way it goes, right? Around the world, anytime there was a colonial power that had a minority ruling over a different majority, when that majority comes into power, you get this, brutal smackdown. And so you do have the challenge of the Alawi, who have, there's 3 million of them or something like that, and suddenly they're going to. I can't. Yeah, it's hard to imagine what some of these minorities are feeling right now because of the history, in a sense, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to see a scenario in which, HTS has been coached up really well. A lot of the Islamists have been coached up by Westerners, So when you see things like meetings with the prime minister, when you see people, saying, "Oh, they're not destroying churches yet. They're permitting people to worship. Isn't this great?" I would say hold off. And the first thing I would say is look at Idlib, because Islamists have been running that province of Idlib for the better part of the last decade. They've been in control there. They were kind of isolated there for a long time. It's near Aleppo, and that's probably how they would govern. Taliban light, or maybe just Taliban. And the SDF knows that. The Alawi know that. The Israelis know that.
Right.
And they're backed by the Turks, and they're backed by Qatar. Qatari
Right. So
money.
you have this situation then where you have I mean these you have a this sudden rising power that has now taken over HTS, um, who is saying all the nice things to ensure the New York Times does a good profile of them. But when they got to Aleppo, when they got to the airport, and hit up the duty free shop, they broke all the whiskey bottles, right? Like so,
Yeah, sure, I know.
there's a certain point you go, okay, now like I see where it really is, but we'll continue to pretend on the pages of the New York Times that this is a moderate Islamist group. I'm curious, like also, I mean, the thing is, you have some major powers that are trying to both project and protect their interests. One of those is Russia, right? Because Russia has both. I mean, their only warm water port that is, I mean, easily accessible to the Mediterranean is right there on the coast of Syria, and they have an air force base there. Their other warm water port, the other warm water port for the Russians is in the Black Sea, but in order to get them out, those ships, they have to go through the Hellespont, which is that narrow strip of water that goes through Istanbul, right? So it seems to me that they're very interested in ensuring that they don't lose that, but it's also in a predominantly Alawite area, right? So you could have a situation in which most of the Alawites flee to that kind of sector, and the Russians, along with what's left of the Alawite people, in a sense, end up there. But it's Russia has been mucking around in this space for a while, right?
Yeah, and those are relationships. The Russian-Syrian relationships go back a long way to the Cold War, and um, I I think we've probably seen the friendliest face of this regime, the new regime that we're likely to see, um, as the interests of the different factions start to come into conflict with each other. Um, More likely, blood will out, as they say, and I think you'll see from HTS a pretty brutal side. Now, I don't think the Israelis are going to object to. Um, the Russians maintaining a presence there, but it's not clear that they will be able to easily maintain that presence. They have their own troubles, of course, in Ukraine right now,
Right,
and
right, right.
that a lot of people have pointed out that the Russians pulling out is the reason that the Assad regime fell. I think that's part of it, but I think that's a smaller part, frankly, than what the Israelis have done to Hezbollah and Iran,
Right,
substantially
right.
diminishing their capability. I mean, really, almost dismantling Hezbollah uh, from top to bottom, and and so that the Shia crescent that people have talked about for years, that direct line from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, that has been a supply line to Hezbollah, has essentially been cut off. So we're looking at a very different. I think I saw someone that said sometimes you see, nothing happens for decades, and then in weeks you have decades of history that
Right, right, right.
happen in a very short period of time. And I think that's what we've seen. Another way of looking at it is that the Syrian civil war is about to go into a new phase, a very, very
Right,
different.
but I mean, in some sense, the Syrian civil war and all the stuff happening in the Middle East is a result of this. I often tell people there's a backdrop you have to hit here of the Islamic civil war that's taking place, right,
Yeah,
between Sunni and Shia Islam, which is not unlike the 100-year wars in Europe between the Protestants and Catholics, right? You know, we have Protestant and Catholics had different visions for, you know, the state and et cetera, and the Bible and all that sort of stuff. And kingdoms aligned themselves with those, you know, those powers, if you will. And we fought each other the Christians fought each other for 100 years on this stuff. And that's where a lot of what's happening in the Middle East, because you have you know, some big epicenters of Shia and Sunni Islam, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and then the kind of the proxies that are kind of smaller but lesser known. Those are kind of going at each other, and into that you have this kind of Syrian civil war that took place. But you're right in bringing up, you know, the role of that Hezbollah played in this, because, you know, 12 weeks ago, 3 months ago, you know, Assad could have called up Hezbollah to come and kind of defend the land, to hold the territory, and
which they did against ISIS and against
exactly,
others.
exactly,
They were the real
and
reason the regime
exactly, and I remember, you know, both ISIS and Hezbollah lost a lot of fighters when they were going at each other. Thousands of Hezbollah fighters died on Syrian soil fighting ISIS. Right? It was and that was that again. ISIS was Sunni, Hezbollah was Shia, and those two groups went at each other. You know, the majority of Assad's regime was held in place by the Shia. I remember we would visit as part of our Philos Leadership Institute. We would go to Jordan, and we visit the refugee camps up in Jordan. That were the Sunni refugee camps, and the people who were there, you know, they were from towns in Syria that were like 10 miles away from the refugee camp, but they were Sunni and had been driven away. And the Russians were trying to, and along with the Assad regime, trying to basically move all the Sunnis out of that kind of the area around the Golan and that, you know, near Jordan. I remember the Russians were praised for securing a peaceful, you know, move of people but a lot of people don't realize the Russians would carpet bomb a city and then carpet bomb another city, and then go to that third city and say, "Hey guys, you want to relocate?" And the people would be like, "Yeah, okay, you know, we'll go somewhere else." And they would, you know, be moved to the northeast, or they would be moved to another part of the country as Assad was trying to ethnically cleanse and kind of clean up these areas.
Many went to Lebanon.
Yeah. Many went to Lebanon. There's a million refugees, Sunni refugees ended up in Lebanon. Yeah. And so you have this situation in which suddenly 12 weeks ago, 3 months ago, Israel begins like basically decimating Hezbollah, right? The Operation Grim Reaper, where they, you know, blew up the hands and faces of 4,000, you know, Hezbollah leadership, and then utterly decimated the actual leadership. Their organizational chart got very empty very quickly, which left almost no fighters for Assad to rely on, right? So you had the loss of Hezbollah. You had, to me, that's probably the biggest factor in why HTS was so able to so quickly move, is because we lost, or, you know, Assad lost the defensive positions pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'll never forget going to the Bekaa Valley in late 2013, early 2014, and there were hundreds of thousands of Sunni refugees from Syria who were displaced, and the Lebanese memory from the civil war when Syria invaded was not favorable, but there they were in a predominantly Shia area under these banners of the Ayatollah and Hassan Nasrallah, and it was a very precarious situation. And today, just to imagine what Israel did to Hezbollah, even a few months ago, we couldn't have
Right.
could not have imagined. No one, few could have imagined, and I don't think anyone predicted anything like this decisive a victory. And Iran is reeling, and it really does go to show this began October 7th. All of this
Right.
undoing began October 7th.
Right.
And if you go back 10 years, Hamas, which is Sunni, was on the side of ISIS and
Right.
was on a different side. So when the Syrian civil war began to calm down, the Iranian regime said, okay, well, here's another proxy.
Right.
We can, for minimal investment, the way that they did with the Houthis in Yemen, for minimal investment, we can get a lot of that out of this. And Hamas and the Palestinian incursion into Israel on October 7th, the slaughter of civilians, ended up being the the cause,
Mm-hmm.
really, of. But for that, it's impossible to imagine how any of these things that followed, including the fall of the Assad regime, would have happened. So it's a really remarkable 15 months, 14 months that we've lived through here in the Middle East. And just coming back to a point that you began with, the end of World War One with the Sykes-Picot agreements. There was a famous line from historian David Fromkin in his book "A Peace to End All Peace." Um, at the conclusion about how the Middle East was still looking for a kind of imperial solution to replace what happened with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans, for their very serious flaws late in the time of the empire, for the most part, maintained stability in the parts of the Near East that we're talking about, Mesopotamia and the Levant, and it could be that we're nearing a time where there is going to be a little bit more stability there, but a lot of it is going to hinge on the outcome of uh, these struggles in Syria.
Yeah. Let me put up a map here for a minute, Andrew, and we can kind of let's kind of talk through some of these areas here. So this is it's hilarious to say that this is an old map because it's like 4 days old, and all that red it basically no longer exists because the red was rebel held territory, Assad territory, right? And there's a couple of because our audience, there's a bunch of Christians in our audience. I'd like to kind of highlight that there is, geography matters a bit in this, and in Israel, and actually all along that kind of eastern shore of the Mediterranean, there's kind of three historic roads, if you will, right? There's the coastal road, which goes along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. Then you have a ridge of mountains. Jerusalem's on this ridge, as is, the ancient cities of Israel, Hebron and Jenin and Shechem and Nazareth, etc. All are kind of in this mountain range. And then to the east, it moves into a plateau. And in the Bible, that plateau is actually named the King's Highway. It's still the King's Highway. You can still you can drive on it today because it's just paved now. Back in the day, it was I don't know. It's probably a combination of gravel and stone or whatever. But those major cities of historic cities, Amman, Damascus, Homs, Aleppo, they're all on that kind of that King's Highway route. And that's all part of what, is historically the Fertile Crescent. So when, Abraham was leaving Ur of the Chaldeans, which is basically in Iraq, kind of out towards Kuwait, it went Abraham followed up, went into Syria, was in Syria, actually, was now Syria when he got called to go into the Promised Land. So you have this kind of arc of where there was fertile land, green land, and then there's a lot of let's say like Eastern Syria, Jordan, and a bunch of parts of Iraq. All that's just utter flat, dry desert. There's nothing, like very little lives there. And so most of the cities are on this kind of King Highway line. They're in, I mean, you can see them here on the map. They're kind of in a row together. And when Aleppo fell last week, that was really began the end of the regime because it lost any kind of defensive lines after that. But what I really want to kind of get into here, Andrew, reason I pulled up this map is that those areas in turquoise that are held by Turkey. So Turkey has had a big role to play in this. We mentioned their hatred of the Kurds. They see the Kurds as really their kind of their arch rival. They're not big fans of the Russians either, by the way. I think both the Russians and Turkey have their empiric powers that want to see their empires once again flourish, kind of thing, and so they're kind of rivals. But what's Turkey's play in this, do you think? And how to, is one thought I had, and you can tell me if I'm way off, or is trying to, like, if you can stretch out the supply lines of the Kurds, maybe they become easier targets, so that maybe that's a play for them. Do they want to take over some of this territory? Are they expansionist? Is there going to be a redraw of the maps of Syria? I'm really curious your kind of your take on what Turkey's role is in this.
Yeah, I think for several years, if you read their own, even their own English language papers, the Turkish public culture line has been very neo-Ottoman, very neo-imperial. I think if you can imagine how Americans would feel if we lost, let's say, much of the American Southwest, and lost it for several decades or even more, and that would rankle American nationalists, and
Right.
there would be a sense of we want that back, and that I think is very much what the Turkish sense is. I think the fact that we say Ottomans instead of saying Turks can be kind of misleading. If you say, well, the Armenian genocide was carried out by the Ottomans, people say, yeah, but that was the Ottomans, not the Turks, as if there was some sort of like ethnocultural transplant of the Turkish population. So this is a part of the world with long memory, and I think the Turks regarded as very much in their interests to expand, maybe the way that Russia would look at Eastern Europe as being kind of proxy, that it's important to create a buffer zone. There have been a number of terrorist attacks carried out by the PKK within Turkey, which is designated as a terrorist organization. The Kurdish people are the largest stateless people on the planet, and they're spread out over Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria for the most part. And it's important to note that the Kurds in those communities don't necessarily agree politically. The Iraqi Kurds in the north don't get along with Syria's Kurds politically and ideologically. They're very much opposed to each other. The Kurds regard this one as a national security threat, but there's also a part, I think it's safe to say, in certainly you see this with Erdogan, you see it with just in the last 24 hours, what he's had to say about how he's talking in almost a possessive way about Syria. And so he's kind of firing a shot at NATO and the US and maybe Israel, saying, if you're going to assert yourself, that's our country you're asserting yourself in. And I think that's why it was so important for, this person with ties to ISIS and Al Qaeda, who spent years in a terrorist prison, who's now a sort of head of state in Syria. It's important for him to appear to be credible, to be someone who's, who knows who's coaching him up. But this is going to be a very telling moment, whether or not NATO and the U.S. stand with the Syrian Democratic Forces, because the Turks will ethnic cleanse Kurds and anyone who they're protecting in the north, along the northern border in Syria, and in the northeast of Syria. It's going to be it's going to get very ugly. I think the collapse of the regime was relatively nonviolent so far. It appears to have been.
Yeah.
The most of the soldiers just threw their weapons down, and we haven't seen reprisals yet against those who were loyal to the regime. I think something like that will be coming. It's going to get tense. What the Israelis have done, by the way, expanding their own buffer zone, I think, in a more benevolent way. What we might see if there is a bloodletting is those who were caught in Damascus or in other places trying to make for the coast, making either for areas held by Kurds, the SDF,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even areas controlled by the Israelis. Certainly, the Israelis would be mindful of the Druze population in southern Syria to protect that community. I don't think the Israelis will just stand by, let the Druze in the south be crushed.
Right. Yeah, let's pull up this map of since you brought up Israel, let's bring up this map of Israel's recent, let's call it like incursion. So one of the big deals was the grabbing of Mount Hermon. So Mount Hermon is when you're in northern Israel, you can it's the big mountain that often is particularly in the wintertime is snow capped. There's a ski resort on the top. Now Israel had basically, part of that mountain, but it was at the top of it was a UN observation post that basically the UN ran away from. And then not the rebels, but the regime, Assad regime forces were also there they had a base there and they also ran away. So basically, without firing a shot, Israel took the entire Mount Hermon, and that puts them within 40 kilometers of Damascus, which is which is very close. And as of news today, is that they're within 25 kilometers of Damascus. Now, to put that in miles, we're talking. I mean, basically, just cut it in half. It's 10 miles away from Damascus. I mean, they could drive there. They could be there in 30 minutes if they started driving. Right, that's really close. Why? I mean, obviously, Israel's looking at this also strategically. And why does Israel go in? Why? And what's in it for them? What's in it for Israel?
Well, with Golan and in the Trump administration, we, the U.S., recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I think you'll see that reasserted next month, and you'll also see, obviously, the U.S. is going to support Israel making these kinds of incursions to protect their interests. But you can also see Mount Hermon from Lebanon, and not just the south of Lebanon, but almost all across from Mount Lebanon across the Bekaa Valley. It looms large there. Just to give people a sense of just how small a region this is that we're talking about. The Israelis have, there was a very good post on this today. This is relatively new, but it gives them a level of security from those heights. Everything from putting anti-ballistic missile batteries there to radar to sensory to being able to increase their warning time for any sort of inbound ballistic missiles. It really gives them control, a kind of tactical control over the south of Lebanon and Syria, that region of southwest Syria that's going to be very key for Israeli security. So this is this is a very big win, and this is since 1967. At least in this particular area, I haven't seen anything of this magnitude. I mean, going into taking Jerusalem had obvious um, uh, significance for for its morale, but this, from a military standpoint, is very, very big. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, there was always a buffer zone that Israel had, even during the Civil War, where it would say to anybody, "Hey, listen, you guys can kind of duke it out with, AK-47s and some 50 cals or whatever, but nothing bigger. No tanks, no artillery, nothing within, 10 miles of the border with Israel." And Israel was pretty clear and kept that. And so, in a sense, they just roll in and say, listen, this buffer zone is a real buffer zone. It's now 100% controlled by us, and move some tanks up there. And it is, again, the geographically, it's a plain, which makes, other than the mountains provide a good natural defensive line historically. Always, plains are hard to defend in any kind of in any zone. And so, Israel moving in and putting some, additional security on those edges, because again, nobody knows quite what this new regime holds. If it's, Taliban-esque. I mean, there were some videos yesterday, of some HTS fighters that are saying, Jerusalem's the next stop, kind of thing. And that kind of rhetoric is really unhelpful, and Israel's trying to be like, no, we're not gonna, don't even try, don't even come close. And Israel also overnight basically took out all of Assad's Air Force. The Navy has been sunk. It's now sitting in the
Chemical weapons, nuclear
chemical weapons factory,
chemical
long range
biological,
missiles.
yeah,
Yeah, doing what they can to make sure,
that
so
doesn't fall into
someone
rebel hands. Yeah,
exactly. Someone said that,
they've
it's
done the world a lot
basically.
of favors. Yeah,
They did. They did the world a lot of favors, but they also did them. I mean, basically telling HTS they're going to have to start from zero, right? They don't come into they don't get you know, a, a, a well stocked armory when they're coming and trying to hold this territory.
yeah. I think the Israelis will want to be good neighbors, and just in case some sort of um, moderate, secular, quasi-democratic regime it comes into power there, that's the result that they ultimately get. But I think they're not naive. They know the
Right.
region, they know their neighbors. They want to stay out of it, but they will intervene where their interests are at stake, or there's an egregious human rights. If they see something like you know ethnic cleansing against Druze, or
A couple more kind of areas I want to bring up before we finish up here. One is, so there's 300,000 Christians supposedly left in Syria for, as of last week. Um, you know, a bunch were in the major cities, Aleppo, Homs. There was a place called the Valley of the Christians. Look it up on Google. There's some really beautiful pictures of that valley and the churches that were there that decorate kind of the hillside. It's gorgeous, gorgeous. And Damascus had a bunch of Christians, historic Christian communities. I mean, dating back to the time of the apostles, etc. So you have this. It's an ancient and historic city in the biblical sense, but where do they go? What's it been like for the Christians in Idlib? Over if HTS has been holding that territory, and where there were ethnic or non-Islamic minorities in that area, how have they been treated? Is that a kind of give us a clue about the Christians? Do the Christians go to Lebanon? Do they go to the coast and try and get on the right side of the Russian defensive lines? They go to the up and hang out with the Kurds and the SDF. Like, what happens with the Christians, you think?
Yeah, as our friend Rich Gazal at IDC said a few days ago, Rich is a Syriac Christian, grew up in America, served in the military, and followed these closely. But he said if I've not been to Wadi Nasara, the Valley of the Christians, but he said it would be like shooting fish in a barrel. If HTS, if the Islamists, if the rebels decide to attack those communities, they're going to be in a very perilous situation. I don't think we have a strong sense of how many Christians are left. The number 300,000 is the one that's most frequently referenced. It could be a little bit more or less than that. It was just in Aleppo alone in 2010, to go back about 14, 15 years. There were probably 1 million Christians in that city before the
Wow.
civil war started. Many of them Armenian. A lot of Armenians during the genocide came to Syria and Lebanon. Um, there's a region in the northeast called the Kabur Valley. ISIS attacked that. That was a heavily Christian area that was attacked in 2015 by ISIS, and many of them were driven out. So the Christians in the northwest, the heavily Alawi uh, zone near where the Russian port and base are located, this is where there are significant numbers of Christians. I think a Maronite bishop told me there were 50,000 Maronite Catholics just in Latakia, the area of the city. That was even still during the Civil War. So you have Damascus. Now, where the Damascus Christians have gone, I think, is the biggest question right now, and the safety of the Christians in Wadi Nasara. Now, even the Christians in SDF-controlled areas of the northeast, in Hazaka, Kamishli, those Christians, Hazaka province, not city, those Christians will be safe. They're protected by the SDF. Many are with the SDF, serve with the SDF, have played significant leadership roles with the Syrian Democratic Forces. And so what's going to be key in the days ahead will be signals from the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, about how much they how willing the incoming administration will be to support the SDF. The Israelis have had talks with them, but I think if you look at a map, you'll see there's a big difference, a very lengthy distance between where Israel is in the Golan and where the SDF is in the northeast of Syria. So that's a challenge. So we're waiting to see what happens. I tend to think it's not going to be good, but the Christian population is already substantially diminished from recent years. I tend to think that knowing what was coming and seeing the government collapse, many of them probably packed up and left. Doubtless many stayed. Some have still stayed in Aleppo, and we don't know how that's going to play out. So, yeah, but as you said, Lebanon is certainly an option. The Damascus Beirut road of transit would be open to them.
Right. So, I've been, people have asked me, and, Luke, what's your, if you were to advise, on this, like, what's the solution? If you, everybody loves to talk about solutions. What would be your recommendation? And what I think would be ideal, honestly, is what I would call an ordered balkanization, which is basically break Syria up along the ethnic lines that are historic. Just, it's like there's nothing left anyways. You have an Alawite state somewhere, have a Druze state, have the Kurds in the northeast, the Kurds in the Syria, kind of, they get territory, and I could even see expansion of Lebanon expands to kind of absorb the Druze that are up in the mountains near Hermon. Maybe Jordan expands and takes more territory north and closes off, so there's no longer a border between Syria and Israel. It's just a continuation of the Jordanian border, which Israel has peace with. I doubt that's realistic, because that would cause some creativity to be had on the part of the State Department. But how do you? What would you be your? What's the ideal Andrew solution to the future of Syria?
Well, I did write about this many years ago, many different places, calling for essentially that something like the model that was used in the former Yugoslavia, to decentralize the government, and as the diplomat who executed that, Richard Holbrooke, said at the time, the U.S. doesn't really have any interest in whether Yugoslavia becomes is one country or three. It doesn't really have an interest in Iraq or Syria for the same reason, and because these are not nation states proper. I think, well, I would completely agree. I would also say that that's essentially what we've had on the ground there.
Right,
That is
right,
that has been the reality. So what you're calling for would just be an acknowledgement of what the reality is, which is
right.
a heavily Kurdish area in the northeast that protects minorities and moderates and secular minded folks. Latakia province, where you have Alawi Christians and some other minorities, the Druze and Christian community in the south, and then just put pressure on what looks like it's going to be an Islamist-dominated central government in Damascus, which would have control of that corridor,
Right.
north-south corridor that you alluded to. But the big question is going to be, if you look at a map of the topography in the desert, um, Syria's oil fields right now. I'm sure I know the Turks have a big interest in that. And so they want to expand into SDF territory. What they're hoping is that that Trump will basically abandon northeastern Syria. I don't think that's how it's going to play out. I tend to think that as much as U.S. policymakers want out of the Middle East, and they want to shift the focus to, first of all, America and then the Indo-Pacific region, I think there are we have too many allies and partners in the region who are concerned about that. We have quite a lot invested in something that has worked very well.
Hmm.
But it will be, um, it will be potentially significant for Christian leaders to step up and say, um, we like northeastern Syria, we like the democracy that's emerged there, and we don't want to see Christians or Kurds and others ethnically cleansed by Turkey. And we
Right.
don't want to see, the government of Qatar. I actually looked this up before our podcast. Its citizen to GDP ratio. The average citizen per GDP is 10 times wealthier than the average American citizen. That's how much wealth they have to play with in Qatar. And so much of that money has gone to radicalization of American campuses,
Hmm.
anti-Western, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian ideology. And the same people who fund Hamas have funded ISIS and ethnic cleansing across the Near East. And at some point, an air base in Doha is not worth the
Right.
price that we're paying. So, Henry Kissinger said to uh, the Gulf Arabs during the boycott, the petroleum boycott in the 1970s, he said, "How long do you think the Americans are going to put up with these long gas lines? How long do you think they're going to suffer that?" And I think that's a message that needs to go to Doha, to the very
Right.
top, very quickly.
Right.
Like, how long do you think the American people are going to suffer all the terrorism, all the anti-Semitism, all the anti-Americanism and anti-Christian uh, funding that is all that being financed by Qatar? So I think actually I wouldn't be surprised if early on in the Trump administration that a very strong signal is sent not just to Ankara but to Doha.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, this has been, I think, very interesting, fascinating conversation, Andrew. I appreciate your insight. Having been on the ground, having worked in this space for a long time, I think you provide an invaluable insight. And it's such a fluid and fast moving and changing reality on the ground. What we say here, in 72 hours could be like, old news, but hopefully we gave enough kind of historic backdrop, some ideas for people to noodle on, about, where to put their thinking, for both the Christians and the future of the region. So thank you very much for joining me. Again, thank you for those who have made it through this whole program and watched the whole thing. I appreciate if you have liked or subscribe, or like and subscribe, and consider a donation to the Philos Project to continue this work. Thank you, Andrew. And once again, until next time,
Thanks,
see you
Luke.
later. Bye.
Okay. Thank you.